Good evening and welcome to our session, Understanding Chicago Manual and AP Style. I'm Nicole and I'll be facilitating your webinar tonight. I would now like to introduce our presenter, Ashley Petry. Ashley is a freelance copy editor for Author Solutions and other book publishers. She's also a copy editor for Booth, a literary magazine, and a freelance journalist specializing in travel, food, and the arts. And with that, Ashley, I'm going to hand this over to you and let you take it from there.
Okay, perfect. So today we're going to talk about two different style guides that you're likely to encounter as you navigate the publishing industry. And a lot of you remember your grammar lessons from, elementary school, middle school, high school, and your teachers always said there's one right answer to all your grammar questions. But the fact is, in the publishing industry, there's not always one right answer. Sometimes there are two right answers, and they're both right depending on which style you're using. The two styles we're going to talk about today are the Chicago Manual of Style and the Associated Press Stylebook. We're going to talk about what are these two styles, and then we're going to talk about when you should use each style. And then for most of the evening, we'll be talking about how these two styles are different. And so what do you need to do differently if you're using one style versus the other style. First, let's just give a brief overview of the Chicago Manual of Style. The publisher of this is the University of Chicago Press. It's been around for about 100 years, and it's now in its 16th edition, which I believe just came out last year. You can see a picture of it here. It's nice, pretty blue. The Chicago Manual of Style is primarily used in book publishing. It's also used for certain academic journals and a few magazines, especially magazines that have a little bit more of a literary focus. For example, Booth, the literary journal that I work with, uses Chicago Manual of Style. The other one that we're going to talk about tonight is the Associated Press Stylebook. This is obviously published by the Associated Press. If you're not familiar with the Associated Press, basically it's an organization composed of newspapers around the world, which allows them to share resources. So if one newspaper, for example, has a reporter in Baghdad or Kiev or another international hotspot, that reporter can write an article that all the newspapers who are members of the Associated Press can then use. So not every newspaper has to have a reporter in every potential place. Or for example, I live here in Indianapolis. If something big happens here that's newsworthy around the world in Indianapolis, the local reporter will write about it, and the newspapers around the world will carry that same story written by the Indianapolis reporter. So it makes sense when you have this sort of collective of newspapers that they would want to have a set of rules to follow to make sure that everyone is producing their articles in the same way, using the same kinds of grammar and punctuation and spelling and things like that. Just makes things easier for everybody. So that's where the Associated Press Stylebook came from. The current edition is actually the 2014. The 2015 will be out in the spring, and it does come out every year with pretty significant updates usually each year, so you do need to make sure you have the current version. The AP Stylebook is primarily used for, as I said, newspapers, but it's also used for magazines, particularly ones that are more consumer-focused, like, for example, Good Housekeeping or, I don't know, anything like that, as opposed to something more literary and focused like Booth. It's also used for online content like blogs, and also for business communications, and by that I mean marketing, advertising, media relations, things like that. So, which one should you use? Most of you who are listening to this webinar tonight are probably either in the process of working on your book manuscript, or you finished one and you're getting ready to market it and get it published. For your book manuscript, you do want to be using the Chicago Manual of Style, which is the standard for the book publishing industry. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to know Associated Press, because there are actually places where it will be helpful for you. For example, if you publish your book and then you want to promote it, if you write a press release about that book that you're sending to local newspapers, it would be better for you to use AP style for that press release, because that's what the newspaper that's going to receive your press release will be using. If you are putting together a website or a blog to promote yourself as an author, Associated Press style is probably your better bet for that. And for example, if your book puts you in a position of being a subject matter expert, maybe a newspaper or a magazine will ask you to write a freelance article about that subject, and in that case, again, you'd want to be using AP style. So even though you're primarily a book writer, I assume, you really do need to know both, be fluent in both Chicago and AP styles. So now that you know that, how are they different? Well, here's a quick list of the differences that we're going to talk about. Chicago and AP differ in the way they use Oxford commas, in the way they spell out numbers or not, in italicizing titles, hyphenating words, using em-dashes and ellipses, punctuating initials, and then they also have some different areas of focus beyond just the grammar and punctuation sorts of things. There are other differences certainly between Chicago and AP, but these are the main ones that you're going to encounter while you're writing. So the first difference, and this is the one I think most people who are a little bit familiar with Chicago and AP know about, is the controversy about whether or not you should use an Oxford comma. This is also known as a serial comma. Basically, it's the last comma that comes in a series. So in our example, she bought eggs, comma, bread, comma, and milk. That comma that's bolded after bread, that's the Oxford comma or the serial comma. Most of you in English class were probably taught to use it, and Chicago agrees with your English teacher about that. Chicago requires the use of the Oxford comma. AP, however, forbids the use of the Oxford comma, except in a few places where it's necessary to prevent confusion. So you'll see here, in the AP example, we have she bought eggs, comma, bread and milk. No second comma. The reason for this, basically, is that Chicago is primarily used for longer works, like books, where individual character spacing isn't that much of an issue. But AP was developed for newspapers, where, after you put in the advertisements, the photos, the infographics, and all that stuff, you really only have a very limited amount of space for your article. So AP tends toward using fewer characters whenever possible, just to save as much space as possible. So that's why AP omits that Oxford comma. So Chicago uses it, AP doesn't. If you have trouble remembering which is which, I just remember that Chicago and comma both start with C, and that's how I remember that I do need the Oxford comma if I'm using Chicago. Okay. A second difference between Chicago and AP is whether or not they spell out numbers or just use the numerals. Chicago is a little bit more complicated in this respect, in that it requires you to spell out 0 through 100 all automatically, plus any larger numbers that are easy to spell out without getting too messy. And if you look at the Chicago Manual of Style, you'll see a few more specific rules about which larger numbers to spell out. But basically, you're spelling out the simple things. 6 items, 47 items, 700 items, 10,000 items. But then, of course, when you get to a number like 36,184, that's just too much to spell out. So Chicago lets you use numerals for that. AP keeps it simpler and, again, shorter by requiring you to spell out only 0 through 9. So 6 items, you can see 6 is spelled out. But for everything else on that list, AP allows you to just use the numerals. Again, it's a space-saving mechanism. There are a few exceptions to those rules. For example, both AP and Chicago require you to use numerals for percentages. And this is the case no matter what percentage number it is. And you should also note that both AP and Chicago spell out the word percent rather than using the percent symbol. The only place where you might use a percent symbol is maybe in a bar chart or something like that. In most cases in text, you're always going to want to spell out the word percent. And then there are some other exceptions. Both AP and Chicago allow you to use numerals for years. But they also treat that year differently if it comes at the beginning of a sentence. They both require you to spell out numbers at the start of a sentence, but AP lets you cheat and not spell it out if it's a year. Whereas Chicago just says, no, you always have to spell out numbers at the start of a sentence. Okay. Another difference between AP and Chicago is whether they italicize titles of various works or put them in quotation marks. The Chicago Manual of Style is going to probably be more similar to what you learned in school, which is that you italicize the quote-unquote big titles and put smaller works in quotation marks. So in Chicago, you italicize the title of a book or a magazine or a newspaper, the title of a TV show, a movie, or an album. But smaller pieces of those things you would put in quotation marks. So a chapter in a book, the title of a chapter in a book would be in quotation marks. The title of an article within a magazine would be in quotation marks. The title of an individual episode of a TV series would be in quotation marks, or the titles of individual songs on an album. So basically the rule is italicize big things, put quotation marks around little pieces in terms of those titles. And that is probably what you learned way back in school. But AP keeps it much simpler and just uses quotation marks for all titles, whether it's big things like the title of a book or a movie, or small things like a song or a poem or anything. AP just uses quotation marks for everything. So keeping it a little simpler. Another big difference between AP and Chicago, and this is a very nitpicky one that frustrates those of us who are trying to always go back and forth between the two styles, is the issue of which words are hyphenated and which ones are not. You can see here just a short list of examples. For example, carryover in AP is hyphenated, whereas carryover in Chicago is not. But login in AP is not hyphenated, and login in Chicago is. There is absolutely no rhyme or reason to which style hyphenates which words. It's just the preference of whoever edits those style books, I think. And so I can't give you a general rule, for example, to say, well, AP always leaves out the hyphen and Chicago always uses it, because that doesn't actually work. Unfortunately, what you have to do is get familiar with each of these words, look them up when you're using them. I pulled this chart. It's a portion of a chart that appears on www.apversuschicago.com, which I highly recommend as a resource for you when you're trying to figure out these issues. You can see this chart, a longer version of this chart, plus some other AP versus Chicago issues that come up. So it's a really good resource for you. The reason that AP and Chicago have different preferences in terms of hyphenation is because they have different dictionaries of choice. For example, the Chicago Manual of Style relies on Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, which you can access online at m-w.com, whereas AP defaults to the Webster's New World College Dictionary, which you can access at websters.yourdictionary.com. So if you're not sure whether to hyphenate a word or not, or if you don't want to go through the trouble of, thumbing through the two style guides to figure it out, you can go to these two dictionary websites and probably find what you need. I should mention, too, that both AP and Chicago have online versions of their style books. You pay an annual access fee, which is roughly equivalent to the cost of buying the book. And the advantage to using the online versions is that they may be updated more frequently, and you have access to some additional content like Q&A types of services and things like that. So that's something to think about if you feel like you're going to be using those resources frequently enough to merit paying for them. But fortunately, both of these dictionaries are free, so you don't have to pay any additional money to access the secondary dictionaries. Okay. Another difference between AP and Chicago is how they use em-dashes and ellipses. Em-dashes are what you see here. Basically, we use them to indicate a very strong interruption in a sentence, a stronger interruption than what we might set apart with commas. So, for example, my brother, em-dash, an absolute genius, em-dash, can solve equations in his head. Now, you'll see that the primary difference here is that in Chicago, there are no spaces on either side of the em-dashes, whereas in AP, we do put spaces around the em-dashes. And this is one of the very rare examples where the AP version actually requires more space than the Chicago version. And I happen to like it better, but that's just my preference. They also treat ellipses differently in terms of spacing. Ellipses, as I'm sure you know, indicate a pause or an omission from a quote or something like that. In Chicago, an ellipses is spaces, or you put spaces within and around the ellipses. So you would literally type space period, space period, space period, space. In AP, you only put spaces around the ellipses, not on the inside. So let me pause, space, dot, 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 space. And your word processor probably then will create a character for that that's just a single character of 3 dots. But it's a pretty simple thing. But just to remember, Chicago has the spaces outside and inside, and AP just has the spaces outside. Another difference between the two is the punctuation of initials. And Chicago does this in a way that, to me, always seems a little bit strange, but that's just me. In Chicago style, initials get both periods and spaces. So you're basically treating them like their own little individual words. So you'll see in this example, P.D. James, it's P period space D. And the same, with M.F.K. Fisher, M period space, F period space. AP, just as you would expect, gets rid of that unnecessary space to save its own space. So AP just does it as P period D period, M period F period K period. Pretty simple. The only exception for both of them, both Chicago and AP, is when you have an entire name that's abbreviated. You'll notice in these previous examples of P.D. James and M.F.K. Fisher, it was only the first and middle names which were abbreviated, and the last name is still there. If you're abbreviating the entire name, including the last name, then you don't need the spaces or the periods. So then you have things like JFK, FDR, and that's how we're used to seeing things like that. Another difference between Chicago and AP that isn't really related to a grammar issue is the fact that both of them have different areas of additional focus beyond what you might consider the style guide. In Chicago, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of pages that talk about how to format in-text citations, how to format bibliographies, and this is because, as I said, Chicago is often used for academic journals, for literary reference works, things where you would expect to find citations and bibliographies. So Chicago has a lot of rules about how to do that, which are beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but if you're ever in the case where you need to figure out how to do that, Chicago can help you. AP does not have a section about citations and bibliographies simply because in the journalism world, that's not necessary. I mean, you never see a newspaper article with footnotes or a bibliography because that's not what you're expected to do in a newspaper article. In a newspaper article, if I'm quoting an art, or if I'm quoting, for example, a study from the Mayo Clinic, I would just write, according to a study conducted by the Mayo Clinic, blah, blah, blah. And, there would be no footnote or any kind of other citation. So AP doesn't worry about telling you how to do that because it doesn't expect you to do that. What AP does have is a special emphasis on media law, and these are legal issues of concern to journalists, and that term now includes bloggers, it includes book authors, anybody who's writing for publication would fall under the protection of these laws. So things like libel, copyright, your rights under the First Amendment in terms of freedom of speech and of the press, you'll find a lot more details in AP on those issues than you will in the Chicago manual style. So if you're, say, writing a memoir and someone who's included in your memoir says, if you write that about me, I'm going to sue you, maybe you get nervous, the AP style book is a good place to go to see what your rights are and what the legal arguments are in terms of whether you can write about that person or not, and if so, what issues you need to keep in mind. So, if you want to read a little bit more about Chicago versus AP, here's my favorite article ever from The Onion, which of course is a satirical news site. This article is from a couple years ago. It's called 4 Copy Editors Killed in Ongoing AP-Style Chicago Manual Gang Violence. And of course, there are arguments about, things like the Oxford comma. This is one of my favorites. It got passed around amongst all my copy editor friends when it came out. So if you want a little chuckle about this, there's a good link for you. I always like to close my webinars by sharing a couple of my favorite grammar resources. The first one I always recommend is the Grammar Girl blog at quickanddirtytips.com/grammargirl. This is a blog that I find very accessible. She gives great examples, her explanations are easy to understand, and on top of that, the blog is really easy to search. So if you realize that you don't remember something about pronouns or commas or something like that, you can just go to her website, type in your question, and your answer will pop up with some really easy explanations. So this is my favorite quick grammar reference. Of course, for this webinar, I'm going to recommend the Chicago Manual of Style and the Associated Press Handbook, both of which are helpful for you to have on hand. The disadvantage to the Chicago Manual of Style is that it is more than 1,000 pages long, and it is a hefty tome. And it can be hard sometimes to find what you're looking for if you're not familiar with how it's laid out. Associated Press, not quite as much, but even it has its little quirks in terms of how you look things up. So what I always recommend is when you first get a copy of either of these, spend a little time with it. Just flip through it, see how it's laid out, see how things are referenced and indexed so that when you do need it to find a quick answer, you're able to use it correctly instead of fumbling through and getting confused. So it is definitely worth the time just to get familiar with it when you first get it. Another couple of grammar resources that I always recommend are Working with Words and When Words Collide. These are both just general purpose grammar books, both of which I think are very easy to search, very accessible, clear explanations. They're just generally good, although they won't always give you the correct answer in terms of Chicago versus AP because they're following sort of the generic grammar rules instead. So those are my favorite grammar resources. We have time for some questions. If you have any questions you want to ask, I will do my best to address them. But if not, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Ashley. It was a lot of great information, and I'm sure our audience appreciated that tonight. And like Ashley just said, if you have any other questions, feel free to send those to me in the chat pane. And for now, I'll go ahead and dive in. So our first question is more just kind of a verification or confirmation of what you said. So this person says, so if I'm writing a novel, I should use Chicago's manual of style. But when I send the press release regarding my book, I should send it in AP style. Is that correct?
That is correct. Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Okay, next question. Is it, okay, this is funny. This is a question that I've kind of stumbled on as well. Is it ma'am with a capital M-A apostrophe A-M or M-A without the apostrophe? How do you spell ma'am if you write it in, say, a novel? Let's say a novel.
That's a good question. I don't actually know if I've written the word ma'am ever.
I believe it would not be capitalized. Do you think?
I believe it depends on the context. For example, the word mother or father is capitalized or not, depending on the context. So I believe it would fall in the same category, but I'm not sure about the apostrophe, to be perfectly honest.
So if you were saying it like a name, like ma'am is, or ma'am sent me this, it might be capitalized, but if you're just, oh gosh, now I don't know that. That's an interesting one.
I think it probably would be capitalized because I'm trying to think of a situation in which ma'am wouldn't be a form of direct address, and you would, of course, capitalize it on direct address.
So like yes, ma'am.
Right.
Yes.
Well, you know what? No, that's not capitalized.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. I don't think, yeah. But yeah, I guess it does depend.
So, yes, the short answer is I probably need to look that up.
Right. So
that would be a good question for the person who asked it to look up when they get their Chicago Manual of Style and their AP Stylebook and they need to spend some time figuring out how to use it.
Right.
That would be a good question.
Yeah. We've got, she just responded.
Sorry.
She responded, thanks, ma'am.
I like that. I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer. I just haven't really needed that one.
Right. All right, so we've got a question regarding a blog, and since that doesn't really relate directly to this webinar, they were just asking how to organize their blog. I would send you to Author Learning Center, and if you remember there, you can just type in blogs or, writing or blog posts, and you'll get a ton of information on that. Even if you're not a subscriber to the Author Learning Center, we do provide quite a bit of our content for free to everybody, so you'll probably get at least a little bit to get you started on organizing that blog. And specifically, I would tell you to search, Joel Scott has a lot of great information on that. He has webinars. You can watch a bunch of stuff on Author Learning Center regarding organizing your blog. And okay, let's see. A printout regarding this. We don't actually offer this as Ashley's and Author Learning Center's proprietary information. So we don't actually offer the PowerPoint out to our audience, but there is a handout I can email you if you'd like. So to the lady in the audience, if you'll just shoot us an email, that email at the bottom there, I'll make sure that you get that handout. Okay, let's see.
Nicole, is that the right email?
authorsupport@authorlearningscenter.com. Yeah, that's fine. That'll get to me.
Okay. Great.
You could also just do nbaker@authorsolutions.com. That'll get to me as well. Okay, what about OK, just the letters O and K versus O-K-A-Y?
Spelled out, O-K-A-Y.
Spelled out, OK.
In both cases.
OK. How much do the books cost?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually just went online to order my 2015 Stylebook, not realizing that it wasn't quite out yet, and I think it was about $25. This Chicago Stylebook is quite a bit more because I mean it's a huge book, and my memory of that, which I bought the current edition maybe a year ago, it seems to me that it was $30 on Amazon and then $60 at like the list price, which you would pay in a bookstore, was $60. So that's actually one where I always like to promote local bookstores, but that's actually one that's significantly cheaper on Amazon.
Mm-hmm. And are the style books available in local libraries?
Yes, they certainly should be. Whether the library has maybe the most current edition of the Stylebook just probably depends on, the schedule by which they order their books. But most of them, I would think any decent library would have both of them in stock, yeah.
I especially would think like a community college or any college library might be a good resource for that if you just kind of want to go and reference something, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And especially if you've got a college that has any kind of media or journalism or PR program, they would almost certainly have that in supply.
Great. All right, well, if there are no other questions coming in, I think that will wrap up our session for tonight. I would certainly like to thank our presenter, Ashley Petry, for sharing her time and expertise. I hope you all found the session to be valuable and informative, and we look forward to having you join us on other webinars as your schedule permits. Please note that there's a ton of other content on the Author Learning Center website, including other webinars, videos, podcasts, and articles, all designed to help you write, publish, and market your book.